Hello guys, and welcome back to Reading Club. So today I'm going to read you My Weird School, Mrs. Roopy is Loopy, Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. Chapter 5, Mrs. Roopy's Hero. Everybody in our class was excited before the next library period. We all wanted to see if George Washington would be there again. When we got to the library, there was just this lady who looked a little bit like George Washington, except she didn't have on an army uniform or a wig. She looked like a normal lady. "Good morning, second graders," she said. "My name is Mrs. Roopy. I'm sorry I couldn't be here the other day for your library period." "But you're here," Ryan shouted. "You must be mistaken," Mrs. Roopy said. "I was home, sick in bed." "Can we see your wooden teeth again?" Michael asked. "Yeah, can we? Wooden teeth? Oh, did you know that George Washington didn't have wooden teeth at all? His mouth was filled with cow's teeth." "Ew!" we all shouted. I asked Mrs. Roopy, "Did the cow have George Washington's teeth in her mouth?" "But that was you, wasn't it, acting like George Washington?" said Michael. Mrs. Roopy's forehead got all wrinkly just like George Washington's did when we told him about computers. "I don't know what you're talking about." We all looked at one another. I wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or not. "If I were George Washington, would I have this?" Mrs. Roopy asked. Then she picked up her shirt and showed us her belly. She had a little tattoo of a heart right over her belly button. It was cool. I had to admit that George Washington would never have a heart-shaped tattoo over his belly button. So maybe that army guy with the wig wasn't Mrs. Roopy after all. "Let me show you around the library," Mrs. Roopy said. "Did you know that books can take you to places you have never been before? They help us explore our world. We have books here on just about every subject you can think of. This is the fiction section. Does anyone know the difference between fiction and non-fiction books?" "Non-fiction books are books that are not fiction," Ryan said, because non means not, like non-fat milk has no fat in it. "And nonsense has no sense in it," Michael added. "That's true," Mrs. Roopy said, "but there's a little more to it." "Fiction is what you get when you rub two things together," I said. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. "That's friction, AJ," Andrea Young said. "Fiction is a made-up story, and non-fiction is based on facts." "That's correct," said Mrs. Roopy, and she smiled at Andrea. I wished Andrea would shut up. "Oh, who cares what the difference between fiction and non-fiction is," I said. "All books are boring." Everybody went, "Ooh," like I had said something really terrible. "But everybody needs to know how to read, AJ," Mrs. Roopy said. "Not me," I said. "When I grow up, I'm going to be a trick bike rider because you don't have to know how to read to do tricks on a bike." "Yeah, me too," said Michael and Ryan. We told Mrs. Roopy that every day after school, me and Michael and Ryan ride our bikes together. I learned how to ride a two-wheeler in kindergarten. Now I can do a bunny hop off a bump, and I know the names of all the famous trick bike riders. I have posters of them all over the walls of my room. "Gee, I don't know much about bicycle tricks, AJ," Mrs. Roopy said, "but I've got posters of my hero on my walls at home, too." "Who is your hero, Mrs. Roopy?" Andrea asked. "Melville Dewey." "Melville whoey?" I asked. "Melville Dewey was a very famous librarian," Mrs. Roopy said, and her eyes got all bright and sparkly and excited. "Librarians aren't famous," I said. "Melville Dewey was," said Mrs. Roopy. "He invented the number system we use to find books in the library. If it weren't for Melville Dewey, we would never be able to find anything." "Wow," Andrea Young said, as if she was really interested in that boring stuff. "So if you want to find books about insects, you'd go to number 595, Mrs. Roopy said. "And if you want to find books about dinosaurs, you'd go to number 567. Libraries all over the world use the system that Melville Dewey invented. Today, we call it the Dewey-Dickmel system. Did all the kids at his school make fun of him because his name was Melville? I asked. I know that if there was a kid named Melville in our school, we would make fun of him constantly. I don't know, Mrs. Roopy said, but would you like to hear a song I made up about Melville Dewey? Yeah, we all shouted. Listening to songs had to be better than reading books. Mrs. Roopy went into her office and came back with a guitar and one of those harmonica thingies you wear around your neck. She strummed a few chords to warm up. You may have heard a folk tale about John Henry, the steel-driven man, Mrs. Roopy said. Well, this is the story of Melville Dewey, the book-sorting man. Then she started to sing. Well, Melville Dewey was a little bitty baby. The first word he said to himself were, I've got to get these books off the floor, and he put them on the shelf. Mrs. Roopy sang the whole song and played her guitar and harmonica too. It was a pretty cool song. This Melville Dewey guy had a race at the computer to see who could sort books the fastest. Melville won the race, but right after he sorted the last book, he dropped dead right on the floor of the library. It was cool. At the end of the song, Andrea Young got up and gave Mrs. Roopy a standing ovation, so we all had to get up too. That's the saddest story I ever heard in my life, Emily said, wiping tears from her eyes. At the end of the period, Mrs. Roopy asked us if we had any questions about how to use the library. Is it true that if we don't return our library books on time, you'll lock us in a dungeon under the school? I asked. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. Don't be silly, Mrs. Roopy said. The dungeon is on the 3rd floor. I think she was telling a joke, but I'm not sure. Chapter 6. Johnny Applesauce. When we came into the library the next time, a guy with a long beard came down the ladder from the treehouse, wearing blue jean overalls. He was carrying a shovel and a big sack. He had no shoes on his feet, but he was wearing a pot on his head. He looked funny, and he looked a lot like Mrs. Roopy to me. Mrs. Roopy, why are you wearing a pot on your head? I asked. Roopy, the guy said in a funny voice. You young uns must be confusing me with some other fella. My name is Johnny Appleseed. It's the year 1800. I travel from town to town planting apple trees most everywhere I wander. You are not Johnny Appleseed, Andrea called out. You're Mrs. Roopy. Ain't never heard of no Roopy, the guy said, making his forehead all wrinkly. Appleseed's the name. Planting apple trees is my game. This year's a darn big country, and I reckon folks are gonna need a heap of apples. No matter what we said, he couldn't convince the bearded guy with the pot on his head that he wasn't Johnny Appleseed. He read us a story about Johnny Appleseed and told us lots of stuff about apples. Did you know that folks have been eating apples for thousands of years? Johnny Appleseed told us. They should chew faster, I said, and everybody laughed. Then Johnny Appleseed took us outside and helped us plant a real apple tree near the playground. Before we went back into school, we had apples for snack. I can't understand why he planted all those apple trees. I can understand why he was dressed funny. But what I don't understand is why he wore a pot on his head. That Johnny Applesauce guy was weird. When we got back to class, I told Miss Daisy all about what happened during the library period. Do you still think books are boring, AJ? She asked me. Yes, I said. So that's the end of this channel. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click many likes and subscribe Reading Club. So I'll come back later with a new and improved channel. Bye everybody, see you later.